there are objections, but that they do not invalidate your proposal. Here you accuse your opposition of wanting perfection or utopia before they will accept any proposal. Nothing but objection. A variation of the call for perfection is the simple articulation of objections. The problem is not whether my proposal is perfect, but whether it would be better to do nothing, or even whether there is an alternative. The appeal to self-interest. Just as in your presentation you pointed out some residual benefits of accepting your point of view, so in the defense of your presentation against your opponent's attacks, you may repeat the appeal. However, here there should be a difference. In the presentation, you appeal to some general interest shared by the whole. But here, your appeal should be the very narrow self-interest of the immediate audience. For example, in a debate about the value of the United Nations, let us suppose you present a list of all the values and accomplishments and promise of the World Forum. Your opponent denigrates its actual accomplishments, and even points out how much harm such an organization may do. In your defense, you will of course answer all the objections worth answering, but there is no reason you cannot add an appeal to narrow self-interest. When speaking to a New York City audience, you might as well point out how much money the United Nations contributes to the economy of the city. Winning the argument. The first stage of a successful defense is the repulsion of specific charges and assaults on your initial presentation. The second stage of defense is an attack on the alternatives. This is especially important if the first stage of your defense has not been as successful as you would have liked. Most arguments are won by showing that one side is better on balance, that is, has more assets and fewer liabilities. However, if your original or first defense has been successful, or if during the second stage of your defense you become successful, then an attack on the alternative position becomes a way of annihilating the enemy and winning the argument. Damning the alternative. Naturally enough, the first procedure in the move to win is called damning the alternative. There are three possibilities here. A, if your opponent explicitly offers an alternative, attack it. B, if your opponent only has an implicit position, bring his case out into the open and attack it. And C, if he fails to offer any kind of alternative, then argue that there is no acceptable alternative to your position, because if there were one, then your opponent would have offered it. Thus you win by default. As an example, we may take your defense of an open society in the social, political, and economic sense. No doubt there are many shortcomings of an open society, but you can doubtlessly defend some of these as being either not really shortcomings or as necessary evils. For example, in an open society there is competition and a great deal of wasteful controversy. However, this is a small price to pay for the great release of creative energy that this makes possible. But in addition to your defense of an open society, you can honestly ask, what is the alternative? Aren't the so-called advantages of a totalitarian society illusory, if not repressive? No defense of an open society has to deny that society's shortcomings. It has only to ask, is there a viable alternative? Two wrongs make a right. Any shortcoming of your position that cannot be defended can still be justified by pointing out the errors or shortcomings of the opposition. The difference between this technique and the one described above is the following. In the case of damning the alternative, you are claiming that on balance, your position is better. In the case of two wrongs make a right, you are claiming that certain apparent liabilities are really justified or caused by the errors of the opposition. For example, let us imagine two countries at war. Country A has as its stated policy that torture is necessary and that the mass murder of civilians is necessary. In other words, atrocities are justified. Country B is opposed to atrocities. It does not excuse atrocities, and when its soldiers commit them, they are punished. Therefore, Country B is less likely to have atrocities committed by its personnel. This is a damning of the alternative. On the other hand, when both countries resort to atrocities as a matter of policy, and not inadvertently on the part of some undisciplined soldiers, then we are not damning the alternative. When Country B says that its atrocities are justified because Country A resorts to atrocities, then the technique of two wrongs makes a right is being used. Ad hominem. This most useful technique seems to appear everywhere. Instead of attacking the specific points of an argument, you attack the man. The special version to be used here is a way of making the audience believe that you have already successfully repulsed every part of your opponent's attack, and now it is time to finish him off. This is like a post-war trial for the losers, wherein you document the evil ways of the opponent. You tell your audience how someone falls into the trap of believing such nonsense. The appeal to ignorance. In this version, we argue that because the opposition cannot prove its case, our case must be true by default. For example, the Warren Commission's report on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy has not convinced everyone because there are loose ends in its evaluation of the evidence. The failure of the Warren Commission report to convince everyone beyond the shadow of a doubt automatically, so this technique would claim, means that those who have argued for a conspiracy are right. One of the major assumptions behind this technique is that the alternatives discussed are the only possible ones. Invincible ignorance and falsification. In this form of attack on your opposition, you accuse your opponent of clinging to principles or beliefs that he accepts uncritically and offers no criteria for refutation or falsifiability. There are people, for example, who believe in the communist conspiracy, in the conspiracy of the military-industrial complex, or in the unbridgeable gap between management and labor, and they believe that these things are true almost as matters of religious conviction. It is thus not the specific belief, but the manner in which it is held, that makes it subject to the charge of invincible ignorance. They refuse to listen to any criticism of their beliefs. They will not debate or discuss the matter. And most important of all, they will not specify what would count against their belief. The appeal to force or fear, the ad baculum. There is no more effective technique for assuring your audience how much better your position is when compared to your opponents than by pointing out the dire consequences that will follow the adoption of his proposal. Here you are appealing to fear. An example of the appeal to fear is the claim or prediction made by insurance salesmen about the death of the father, the eventual suffering of the family. If all else fails, this fearful consequence will close the deal. Abandoning discussion. If you are absolutely convinced that you have overwhelmed your opponent, then you should cut off the discussion as soon as possible. To pursue the discussion beyond the point at which you have clearly won is to give your opponent an opportunity he does not deserve. It is to risk throwing away your victory, and it is to lend credibility to your opponent's case. Once you have won, cut off the discussion by saying something like, "I never argue with a man who is wrong." Going for a tie. Nobody wins them all. Not only will you have bad days, but the opposition may just be lucky, or the audience a bunch of complete dimwits. Hence, you cannot expect to win them all. Suppose you have counterattacked as much as you could, and suppose you have tried to win, but you simply cannot achieve a decisive and clear-cut victory. Then what do? You go for a tie. You do not admit defeat. Under no circumstances should you admit defeat. Remember that there are three possible stages of your position. You are completely right, or you are mostly right, but your position needs a few qualifications and corrections, or you knowingly defended a weak position in order to dramatically call attention to a useful underlying principle. True by definition. You can always save your position by making it true by definition. This is not a victory. When you are forced to use this technique as a form of defense, it always leaves the audience with the impression that your position was trivial and the argument almost a waste of time. Suppose, for example, you have argued that abortion is always an act of murder. No matter what your opposition throws at you, you will always be right if you say that you mean by murder the destruction of any living cell. The implications of this position might be pretty silly. For example, the destruction of plant life is murder, but you will at least be safe in your claim that abortion is murder. Forestalling disagreement. Perhaps a more effective technique when you must go for a tie is to argue that your opponent really agrees with your position. Thus, there is no real argument and no real disagreement. This tactic is so surprising that when, after having demolished their opponent, they find him claiming that everybody agrees, they fall right into the trap of being nice. Usually people who are interested in the truth fall into it. Invitation. When you see that you cannot do anything else, give a summary of the progress of the argument, including the positions of both sides. Make the summary as positive and as friendly as possible. Organize it so that it looks as progressive as possible. That is, as if the argument has been heading progressively in a certain direction almost by prearrangement. Conclude with the remark that we have not come to the end or final determination, and issue an invitation to your opponent to join you in the common search for the truth. After all, isn't that what argumentation is all about?
You have been listening to The Art of Deception by Nicholas Capaldi, published by Prometheus Books. For more information about this or any of our other titles, please call 800-421-0351.